Every difficult day leaves behind something that rarely ends when the day itself is over. The conversation is finished. The drive home is quiet. The notifications stop. Still, one careless sentence keeps returning, as though it was spoken only moments ago. You replay what happened, search for the response you wish you had given, and carry someone else's behavior into moments they were never part of. A few brief minutes begin shaping an entire evening, then another day, sometimes much longer. It becomes so familiar that you hardly notice how much of your inner life is being governed by experiences that have already passed. At first, the explanation seems obvious. Someone crossed a line. Someone acted unfairly. Their choices disturbed your peace. But if that were the whole story, the same event would affect everyone in the same way. It never does. One person brushes off an insult that another remembers for years. One sees rejection as proof of failure, while someone else sees the same moment as a change in direction. The world presented the same circumstance. What changed was the meaning each mind gave it. Hidden inside that difference is something remarkably easy to overlook, because blaming the world feels far more natural than examining the quiet interpretations shaping every emotional reaction. Long before psychology began exploring the relationship between thought and emotion, the Stoics were studying that invisible space between what happens and what follows within the mind. The first feeling may arrive without permission, but what grows from it depends on something far deeper than circumstance. Once that realization begins taking root, anger no longer appears as something placed inside you by other people. It becomes something your own interpretations have been quietly sustaining, and that discovery changes far more than your emotions. It changes the way you experience reality itself. Think about the last time someone ruined your mood. Maybe it was a careless comment made in passing, a look that felt dismissive, a message left unanswered, or criticism that stayed with you long after the conversation had ended. The strange part is that the event itself often lasts only a few moments. A sentence is spoken, a decision is made, someone walks away, and life continues moving forward exactly as it always has. Yet your mind refuses to move with it. Hours later, while everything around you has changed, that single moment remains frozen. You replay it while making dinner, while driving home, while trying to fall asleep. New responses appear that never came to you in the moment. Different versions of the conversation unfold in your imagination, each one ending with the words you wish you had said. Without noticing it, you continue participating in an interaction that no longer exists anywhere except inside your own thoughts. The other person may already be focused on something completely different, unaware that they are still occupying space in your mind. What feels like a reaction to them has quietly become a conversation with yourself. This is where the misunderstanding begins. It seems completely reasonable to believe that another person's behavior created the anger because the emotion appeared immediately after the event. Cause and effect feel obvious. Someone acted unfairly, so naturally you became upset. Someone ignored your effort, so disappointment followed. Someone questioned your abilities, so frustration emerged. The sequence feels so convincing that very few people ever stop to examine it more closely. They assume the emotion traveled directly from the outside world into their inner one, leaving no room for anything in between. But if that explanation were complete, everyone would experience the same emotional response to the same event. They don't. One person laughs at an insult that deeply wounds someone else. Another receives criticism with curiosity, while someone beside them hears only rejection. Two people lose the same opportunity, yet one sees defeat, while the other sees unexpected freedom. The event remains unchanged. The difference lies somewhere else, somewhere less visible than the circumstances themselves. The Stoics spent centuries studying that invisible space because they understood that it quietly governs nearly every emotional experience. They did not deny that difficult events happen or pretend that pain can simply be ignored. They observed something much simpler and at the same time much more unsettling. Between what happens and what you feel, the mind is constantly assigning meaning. It does this so quickly that the process becomes almost impossible to notice. A comment becomes disrespect. Silence becomes rejection. Delay becomes betrayal. Failure becomes proof that you are not enough. As Epictetus observed, people are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them. The external event arrives first, but the emotional weight is added by interpretation. That does not mean your emotions are fake or that they should be dismissed. They are real experiences. What deserves closer attention is the quiet process that shaped them before you were even aware it had begun. Once you begin seeing this, anger no longer appears as an unavoidable consequence of life. It begins looking more like a habit of interpretation that has been practiced so often it now feels automatic. Automatic reactions rarely announce themselves. They do not ask for permission before taking over your thoughts. Instead, they arrive wearing the disguise of certainty. Your mind tells you that your conclusion is simply reality, not realizing it has already filled in countless details that were never actually confirmed. A delayed reply suddenly becomes evidence that someone no longer values you. A brief expression on another person's face becomes proof of judgment. Someone forgetting to acknowledge your effort becomes intentional disrespect. Very little of this comes from direct observation. Most of it comes from assumptions quietly completing unfinished stories. The human mind dislikes uncertainty. Faced with incomplete information, it naturally begins creating explanations. Those explanations often feel so convincing that questioning them seems unnecessary. Yet many emotional storms begin with conclusions that were never true to begin with. That question is uncomfortable because it quietly redirects responsibility inward. It is far easier to spend years believing that difficult people are the source of your emotional instability than to recognize how often your own interpretations are shaping the experience. This realization is not about blame. The Stoics were never interested in making people feel guilty for experiencing emotion. Their goal was freedom. Freedom becomes possible only when you recognize where your influence actually begins. If every emotion is entirely created by someone else's behavior, then peace will always remain dependent upon circumstances beyond your control. You will need kinder people, fairer treatment, better timing, and fewer disappointments before your inner world can finally settle. That is an exhausting way to live, because life rarely agrees to those conditions. If this way of looking at life resonates with you, consider subscribing. This place is built for people who want to understand themselves more deeply, think more clearly, and approach life with greater wisdom. A different possibility begins opening once you recognize that interpretation stands between events and emotions. Suddenly, the mind is no longer a passive victim of circumstances. It becomes an active participant in every emotional experience. That realization does not erase anger overnight or prevent disappointment from appearing. It simply reveals that your inner world is more flexible than you once believed. The stories your mind creates can be questioned. The assumptions can be examined. The conclusions can be slowed down before they become emotional certainty. Little by little, you begin responding less to imagined meanings and more to reality itself. That quiet shift marks the beginning of genuine emotional mastery, not because the world has become easier, but because you have finally started seeing the difference between what happened and what your mind has been telling you about it. The difficulty is not in accepting that interpretation shapes emotion. The difficulty is recognizing your own interpretation while it is happening. The mind works with remarkable speed. Before you consciously understand what occurred, it has already organized the experience into a story that feels complete. Someone interrupts you, and your thoughts immediately whisper that they do not respect you. A message goes unanswered, and within minutes the silence begins transforming into rejection. Plans change unexpectedly, and disappointment quietly becomes evidence that life is working against you. These conclusions arrive so naturally that they rarely feel like opinions. They feel like facts. That is why they become so difficult to challenge. Once an interpretation disguises itself as reality, the emotion attached to it becomes equally convincing. Anger no longer feels like one possible response. It feels like the only reasonable response available. Life constantly demonstrates how unreliable those first conclusions can be. Think about two people receiving the exact same criticism at work. One spends the rest of the week questioning every decision they make, replaying the conversation until confidence slowly disappears. The other listens carefully, thanks the person for the feedback, adjusts what needs improving, and continues moving forward without carrying resentment into the next day. Nothing about the criticism changed. The words were identical. The situation remained the same. The only difference existed inside the minds of the two people experiencing it. One interpreted the criticism as a judgment of personal worth. The other interpreted it as useful information. The emotional outcome followed the interpretation rather than the event itself. This happens so often that it becomes impossible to ignore once you begin paying attention. Everywhere you look, circumstances remain surprisingly similar, while inner experiences vary dramatically. This realization sits at the heart of Stoic practice. Before trying to control behavior, the Stoics trained themselves to observe the movement of thought. They understood that reacting without examining perception is like trying to steer a ship without first knowing where the current is taking you. Observation comes first, because action built upon confusion rarely produces wisdom. Instead of becoming absorbed by the behavior of other people, they became curious about the quiet judgments forming inside themselves. Why did those words create frustration? Why did that delay feel unbearable? Why did a small inconvenience suddenly become overwhelming? These questions were never intended to encourage endless analysis. They existed to slow the automatic process just enough for awareness to enter. In that brief pause, emotion loses part of its momentum, and reason finally has an opportunity to participate. Beneath almost every strong emotional reaction lies something older than the event itself. A criticism may awaken the fear of never being good enough. Disrespect may expose a deep desire for approval. Rejection often reveals expectations that were never questioned in the first place. The surface emotion appears to concern today's situation, but its roots frequently reach much further back. That is why similar experiences continue producing similar reactions throughout life. Different people, different conversations, different places, yet somehow the emotional pattern remains familiar. Without realizing it, the mind keeps returning to the same hidden beliefs and asking the world to confirm them. Then, when reality cooperates, those beliefs grow stronger. The reaction feels justified because it has been repeated so many times that it becomes part of identity rather than simply another mental habit. Reacting requires very little effort. Reflection demands something far more difficult. It asks you to remain present long enough to notice your own thinking before becoming completely identified with it. This is uncomfortable because it removes the certainty that anger often provides. It is much easier to conclude that another person is entirely responsible for your emotional state than to admit that your own expectations quietly shaped the experience. Expectations often remain invisible precisely because they seem reasonable. You expect honesty, appreciation, fairness, punctuality, understanding, respect. None of these desires are inherently wrong. Problems begin when the mind quietly transforms them into demands that reality must satisfy. As Seneca observed, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. The moment life fails to meet those demands, frustration appears almost automatically. What seemed like anger toward another person often began as resistance to reality, refusing to follow an internal script. Over time, this way of observing begins changing ordinary moments that once seemed insignificant. Waiting in traffic becomes an opportunity to notice impatience before it grows into irritation. An uncomfortable conversation becomes a chance to recognize defensiveness instead of automatically feeding it. A forgotten promise becomes an invitation to examine disappointment without immediately assigning blame. None of these situations become pleasant overnight, but they stop feeling as though they possess unlimited power over your inner world. Awareness creates a small amount of distance between the event and your response. That distance may appear almost invisible, yet it is where freedom quietly begins. The stronger your ability to notice the judgments beneath your emotions, the weaker those emotions become at convincing you they represent absolute truth. Gradually, something unexpected happens. Anger starts losing the certainty it once carried. It still appears because you are human, but it no longer arrives wearing the disguise of unquestionable reality. Instead, it becomes information pointing toward something deeper inside the mind. An expectation, a fear, an attachment, a belief that has gone unexamined for far too long. Once you begin seeing emotional reactions in this way, difficult people stop being your greatest teachers by accident alone. They become mirrors revealing the hidden assumptions that have quietly directed your life for years. That realization marks the beginning of genuine self-mastery, because lasting peace has never depended solely on changing the world around you. It begins with understanding the invisible world, interpreting it. Emotional mastery is often misunderstood because it is judged from the outside instead of experienced from within. A calm person is frequently assumed to be someone who no longer feels deeply. Someone who remains composed during conflict is sometimes described as detached, indifferent, or emotionally distant. This misunderstanding has followed Stoicism for centuries. Many people picture the Stoics as individuals who hardened themselves until nothing could affect them anymore, as though wisdom required becoming less human. That image is persuasive because it appears strong, but it completely misses the point. The Stoics never sought to eliminate emotion. They sought to prevent emotion from becoming the unquestioned ruler of their decisions. They knew disappointment would still arrive, grief would still visit, fear would still appear without invitation. Anger itself was never treated as proof of failure. The real question was always what happened after the emotion appeared. Did it immediately seize control of thought, speech, and action, or did reason quietly step forward before the emotion decided everything on its own? Unfortunately, very few people notice where one ends and the other begins. The transition happens so quickly that emotion feels inseparable from identity. Someone speaks harshly, and within seconds the mind begins constructing arguments, rehearsing retaliation, searching for proof that the other person was wrong. What started as a brief emotional impulse rapidly becomes an entire mental world built around protecting the ego. Hours may pass before the body begins calming down, yet the mind continues feeding the experience with fresh interpretations, imagined conversations, and repeated justifications. The original event may have lasted 30 seconds, but the emotional reaction quietly extends it into an entire day. This is how temporary emotions become lasting states of mind, not because the emotion itself remains that long, but because thought continues renewing it again and again. There is, however, a space so small that it often goes unnoticed. It exists between the first emotional impulse and the action that follows. It may last only a second, sometimes less. Yet within that brief pause lies one of the greatest forms of freedom available to any human being. Most people never experience it because life has trained them to move immediately from feeling to reacting. Someone offends them, and words leave their mouth before awareness has fully arrived. Something goes wrong, and frustration immediately dictates behavior. The habit becomes so automatic that it feels impossible to interrupt. But every person who has ever responded with patience instead of retaliation has entered that space, even if only for a moment. They paused long enough for another possibility to appear. This practice grows stronger through ordinary moments rather than extraordinary ones. It develops while standing in long lines, sitting in traffic, receiving unexpected criticism, or dealing with everyday disappointments that seem too small to matter. These situations become training grounds because they reveal how quickly the mind wants to surrender its balance. Each inconvenience offers another opportunity to notice the first emotional movement without immediately obeying it. At first, the pause feels awkward because the habit of instant reaction has been reinforced for years. Gradually, it becomes more familiar. The space between impulse and response begins expanding almost without effort. What once felt impossible slowly becomes natural. Calm stops feeling like something forced and starts becoming something chosen. An unexpected change follows. Emotions themselves become easier to understand because they are no longer racing past unnoticed. Anger begins revealing disappointment beneath it. Anxiety exposes uncertainty. Defensiveness points toward insecurity. Instead of treating emotions as enemies that must be defeated, you begin recognizing them as signals asking for attention without demanding obedience. This shift creates compassion without sacrificing discipline. You stop judging yourself simply for feeling deeply while also refusing to let those feelings dictate your character. The emotional experience remains fully human, yet your relationship with it becomes fundamentally different. You are no longer carried wherever each passing emotion decides to go. Over time, people notice your steadiness without necessarily understanding where it comes from. They assume you are naturally patient or unusually calm, unaware that what they see is the result of countless invisible decisions made inside those quiet pauses. They never witness the impulses you chose not to follow, the harsh words you allowed to dissolve before speaking them, or the interpretations you questioned before accepting them as truth. Real emotional mastery has always been built there, inside moments too small for anyone else to notice. It is not measured by the absence of feeling, but by the growing ability to remain present long enough for wisdom to speak before emotion claims the final word. Notice how convincing anger feels in the moment it appears. It arrives with absolute certainty, insisting that immediate action is the only reasonable response. It tells you that silence would be weakness, patience would be surrender, and restraint would somehow diminish your dignity. Under its influence, speaking quickly begins to feel courageous, interrupting feels justified, and retaliation seems like proof that you respect yourself. The strange part is that anger almost always presents itself as a protector. It claims to defend your values, your reputation, your time, or your sense of fairness. Because its intentions appear noble, very few people stop to question the methods it recommends. They assume that because the emotion feels powerful, the actions it inspires must also be powerful. Only later, when the intensity fades, does a different picture begin to emerge. Think back to moments when emotions made decisions before reason had the chance to participate. A conversation that could have ended peacefully suddenly became an argument that lasted for days. A relationship slowly weakened because harsh words spoken in a few emotional seconds continued echoing long afterward. Opportunities disappeared because pride refused to tolerate criticism. Even when the other person was clearly wrong, the reaction often created consequences that extended far beyond the original problem. This is one of anger's quiet deceptions. It narrows attention until winning the immediate moment feels more important than protecting the future. While consumed by emotion, the only goal becomes proving a point, defending an identity, or forcing someone else to understand. Rarely does the mind ask what tomorrow will look like after today's reaction has finished unfolding. That is why anger creates such a convincing illusion of control. Raising your voice feels decisive. Delivering the perfect comeback creates the impression of strength. Refusing to let something go appears fearless. For a brief period, it almost feels as though you have reclaimed authority over the situation. Yet, if you examine what actually happened, something entirely different becomes visible. The emotion dictated your words. It determined your tone. It controlled the pace of your thinking and the direction of your attention. What appeared to be personal power was often the surrender of personal freedom. The louder anger speaks inside the mind, the smaller your ability becomes to choose another response. Control never truly belonged to you during those moments. It belonged to the emotion convincing you that it was acting on your behalf. This contradiction fascinated the Stoics because they understood that genuine strength cannot exist without self-command. A person capable of dominating an argument while remaining unable to govern their own thoughts has not achieved mastery. They have simply exchanged one form of weakness for another. Winning against another person means very little if the cost is losing authority over your own mind. This becomes especially clear when you observe how differently calm and anger influence judgment. Anger rushes toward conclusions because certainty feels satisfying. Calm remains willing to gather more information before deciding. Anger searches for evidence that confirms its story. Calm remains open to discovering that the first interpretation may have been incomplete. Anger demands immediate action because waiting feels unbearable. Calm understands that time often reveals what emotional urgency hides. As Aristotle observed, it is easy to become angry, but to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, is not easy. Neither state changes external reality, yet each creates an entirely different relationship with it. One narrows perception until only threat remains visible. The other expands perception until complexity returns. Suddenly, another person's actions are no longer reduced to simple categories of enemy or ally, respect or disrespect, victory or defeat. Reality becomes more nuanced, and wiser decisions naturally follow. This does not mean calm people avoid confrontation or accept mistreatment without response. Stoicism has never been about passive acceptance. It has always been about deliberate action. There are moments when firm boundaries must be established, difficult conversations must happen, and injustice must be challenged directly. The difference lies in the source of those actions. A response guided by anger usually seeks emotional relief before anything else. A response guided by clarity seeks resolution. One attempts to discharge uncomfortable feelings as quickly as possible. The other attempts to solve the actual problem. From the outside, the two responses may appear similar because both can involve speaking firmly or refusing unacceptable behavior. Internally, however, they are completely different experiences. One is driven by impulse. The other is guided by intention. Few people realize how exhausting constant emotional reactivity becomes over time. Every disagreement consumes energy long after it ends. Every imagined insult requires mental attention. Every unnecessary argument leaves behind emotional residue that quietly follows you into conversations that had nothing to do with the original conflict. Eventually, the mind becomes conditioned to expect offense even where none exists. Ordinary situations begin triggering defensive reactions because vigilance has become a habit. Peace grows increasingly difficult to experience, not because life has become harsher, but because the nervous system has learned to remain prepared for battles that often never arrive. This is one of the hidden costs of uncontrolled anger. It rarely limits itself to isolated moments. It gradually reshapes your entire relationship with the world. The Stoics understood that preserving inner stability required protecting attention as carefully as others protect possessions. Once your attention becomes completely captured by another person's behavior, your inner freedom quietly begins slipping away. They may not control your circumstances, but they begin influencing your thoughts, your emotions, and eventually your choices. This is why refusing unnecessary provocation is not an act of avoidance. It is an act of self-respect. You are choosing not to allow another person's temporary behavior to become the permanent architect of your internal state. That decision often feels invisible because it happens entirely within the mind, yet it represents one of the strongest forms of discipline a person can develop. Gradually, something remarkable begins changing. Situations that once demanded immediate emotional reactions lose much of their urgency. You notice criticism without instantly becoming defensive. You encounter disrespect without feeling compelled to prove your worth. You recognize anger arising inside you without assuming it deserves obedience. That does not make you indifferent. It makes you increasingly difficult to manipulate. The person standing before you still possesses opinions, moods, and unpredictable behavior, but none of those things automatically determine your own. In that quiet independence, real strength finally reveals itself. It was never hidden inside louder words, sharper arguments, or quicker retaliation. It was waiting in the ability to remain fully responsible for your own mind, regardless of what another person chose to bring into the moment. Steadiness rarely begins with mastering difficult people. It begins with becoming less of a stranger to yourself. That may sound simple, yet it is one of the hardest forms of work because the mind naturally prefers looking outward instead of inward. It is easier to analyze someone else's flaws than to examine the invisible patterns shaping your own reactions. When a conversation